Hey y'all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell, and this is my February wrap-up. I read 12 things in the month of February. I had a really great reading month. Most of them were very short. I tried to focus mostly on Black authors since February is Black History Month. So 9 of my 12 reads were from Black authors this month, but I also finished up the Murderbot diaries with 2 reads from that series, and I read another book from a TBR from my last video where I was trying to build a TBR from every single year that I've been alive out of the top 15 most popular books. So that's a really fun video if you want to go watch that. And the book that I chose from that TBR is Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. I'll save those 3 books for the end, and let's dive into all the books I read this month from Black authors. The first book I read in February is Lone Women by Victor LaValle. This is a historical horror book about a Black woman in the early pioneer days, I believe in the 1800s. The book starts off, her parents are dead and her house is on fire, and she is fleeing the scene with a large trunk with mysterious contents inside. You don't find out until much later in the book what is in the trunk. And so it is a little bit of a mystery the entire time, what's in the steamer trunk, and it's obviously something horrifying that she's trying to hide from the world. But she goes to Montana. She is claiming land under some sort of like homesteading act where people at the time, if you went out and farmed on land for at least 3 years, then you got to keep it. It was open to anyone, including women, people of color, things like that. Where the title comes from, she was just a lone woman going out and attempting this homesteading feat. She really had no idea, I think, what she was getting herself into. But the whole time that she's traveling to Montana, she settles down, she finds her plot, she's like trying to make a living for herself. She's just really anxious about someone else finding out what's in the trunk. So that's the basic premise. I really loved that this book focused on minority characters in what often is considered like a very simplistic time in American history where you don't hear about the plights of people who are not white. But to me, the pacing in this book was a little bit weird. I felt like some things were really slow and took a long time, and on the other hand, sometimes big important things would happen and it would just be like over all of a sudden, and like I wanted to linger in those big moments a little bit more. I also thought this book felt a little too cozy in some way to be what I would traditionally think of as horror, although the book definitely like ended in a bit of a bloodbath. So it was horror, but at the same time, like all the character interactions and the kind of found family that happens and the way the book ended all felt very warm and intentional. So I really liked all those aspects, but it makes this book a bit hard to define genre-wise for me. I also thought that some plot elements were a little too over the top or like too convenient, but at the same time, I did have a really fun time reading this book. I read it in one day, and I would definitely recommend it if any of that sounded intriguing to you. The second book I read in February was Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This book is a near-future dystopian in which the American prison system has turned into something of like a gladiator-style sports arena entertainment complex. And it's basically all one big reality TV show where any convict who is on death row or has a life sentence can instead sign up to be a gladiator, and if they can survive for 3 straight years of combat, then they will be released. So this is obviously a scathing critique of America's modern prison day system. I thought it was a really, really interesting concept. It focuses mostly on these 2 women gladiators who are in a romantic relationship and just kind of their inner lives in turmoil. But at the same time, it doesn't really focus too long on any specific characters, because this book, I think, does a really good job of making you actually feel like you are watching a reality TV show when you are reading the book. So it focuses on not only the gladiators and not just the main 2, but other gladiators as well, but also on the fans, on the protesters, the announcer for the games. You get points of view from all of these different people, and it provides a really unique narrative that I thought was really interesting. There were also footnotes all throughout the book, and this is part of where my issues with this book come from, is that some of the footnotes were like branding for like the corporate sponsors for the games, and it added to that kind of reality TV feeling of the read. But then other times the footnotes were actual real life facts about the American prison system and its abuses. And that really pulled me out of the story, because we would be in this near future dystopia and then it would talk about like, you know, 2016 prison figures. So that just like really felt a little bit lurching and clumsy and pulled me out of that immersion that I want when I'm reading something. So I thought a lot of those would have been much better served as an author's note at the beginning, or perhaps a preface to the book. But the fact that they were sprinkled throughout really felt like I was being beat over the head with the message that the author was trying to portray. I did think that every character's perspective was very unique and interesting, although absolutely horrifying. One of the points of view was also like a daughter of an inmate who was out in the world trying to advocate for prison reform. So there was all these really interesting perspectives on what was happening. Overall, I think this was really well done, but again, I did feel like the message was a little bit too in your face to really enjoy fully. I think it would have been a bit more powerful if it was more understated, because the message was, I think, really clear even without the blunt facts of it. But overall, I would really recommend this book, especially if you are a fan of the dystopian genre and like books with social justice type themes. The third book that I read this month was Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, and this is the most powerful, hard-hitting, and realistic dystopian novel I have ever read. Absolutely my favorite read of the month, 5 stars without a doubt. One of the most surreal things about reading Parable of the Sower is that the narrative kicks off in 2024, even though it was written all the way back in 1993, and so that was a bit surreal. So basically the premise for this one is our main character starts off as a girl. She is about 15 years old. Her name is Lauren Alamina. She lives in a suburb of Los Angeles in a time when really American society has pretty much completely crumbled due to climate change and economics and political decisions. Communities that still exist are basically like little walled subdivisions, and everything outside of the walls is just absolute chaos. There's rampant drug use and murdering, and people are just really, really hard out there. And so everything that they do, they pretty much do inside the walls of the community. They grow their own food. They try to protect each other as best they can. Lauren's father is a Baptist preacher, and she has started to realize as a 15-year-old that she doesn't really believe the things that her father believes. And she basically starts to create her own religion, but she doesn't think of it that way. She thinks of it more as she is discovering truths about the world, and she's putting them all down on paper. The story progresses over a number of years, and really I feel like the meat of the narrative kicks off when the walls of her community are broken into, and a lot of her community is murdered. The buildings are set on fire, and she has to escape, and she ends up going out on the road. She decides to go north because in Los Angeles there is no rain and water is very expensive, and she knows if she goes north, at least the water will be free because it rains there. And her goal once she gets out on the road is to create her own community. She really believes that we can live better, that we can live differently, and make a life on earth that is worth living, that where people don't have to experience all these hardships. The book is extremely gritty and gruesome. The things that she experiences and that she witnesses are really horrifying. At this time in society, no one keeps dogs as pets anymore. They are predators and they're constantly prowling around. One of the scenes that really sticks in my head is when she's out on the road and she sees a dog just like carrying like a bloody toddler's arm in its mouth. And that was just horrifying, but it barely scratches the surface of what all is in this book. Another interesting aspect of this story is that Lauren suffers from a condition called hyperempathy because her mother was a drug abuser of a drug that doesn't exist obviously in our real world, but the side effects of that was that her daughter has this hyperempathy condition, which means she experiences the pain of other people when she sees them having pain. She also can experience their pleasure as well, but only if she sees them suffering pain or experiencing pleasure. And because there is so much pain in the world and she sees so much of it, it's a really debilitating sort of condition for her. And so she has to navigate that and try and hide that from other people as she's out on the road trying to survive. That's about all I can say about Parable of the Sower without revealing just the entire thing, but I was just really wowed and horrified by the story, and I immediately jumped into the sequel, which is Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. Parable of the Talents is, the way Octavia E. Butler explained it in the author's notes was that she really meant for this to be a complete story, and the only reason she split it up into 2 books was because it was getting too long. But she wanted this to be a complete reading experience for people, as it is just a continuation of Lauren Alamina's story. So in Parable of the Talents, we also get another point of view, and that is from Lauren's daughter. Lauren's daughter kind of sets up the framing narrative, but then it flashes back to Lauren's life, I think about 5 years after the end of Parable of the Sower. And along Lauren's journey, you know, as she was on the road, she was spreading the word about Earthseed, which is this religion philosophy that she came up with and believes very strongly in. She created this community for people, and basically in Earthseed has pretty well developed into a cult, and Lauren is the cult leader. And then you have the framing narrative of the daughter once she's grown, and she is reading through a lot of her mom and her father's writings of this time, and it's clear that her daughter doesn't view her in the most kind light because of things that happen throughout their life. And so that's a bit of a mystery that unfolds as the narrative goes along. But really, I would say Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, the Earthseed duology is a story of a cult leader in a crumbling United States and everything that she suffers and sacrifices to see her belief system become a reality. It's searing, it's hard-hitting. It's one that I'm not gonna stop thinking about for a very long time. I would definitely say check content warnings before you dive into the series because Octavia E. Butler pulls no punches. Parable of the Talents was just a searing finish, and I really, really enjoyed this series. I'm so glad that I read it and can now recommend it to you all. Next up, I read a poetry collection by Amanda Gorman called Call Us What We Carry. For those of you unfamiliar, Amanda Gorman was the poet that read the inauguration poem at Joe Biden's presidential inauguration. I've been interested in reading her poetry ever since then, and I'm so glad that I finally got around to it. Call Us What We Carry is a collection that really is about the COVID-19 experience. So many of her poems are about living through the pandemic, about George Floyd and being a Black American during that time, but really just about the loneliness, the separation that we all felt, the unknown of what was to come. It was really, really impactful. She also included a lot of history in either footnotes or wrapped into her poetry of parallels to the 1918 flu pandemic and just other events throughout history that were relevant. She used a lot of nautical themes and like water imagery throughout, which I thought was really beautiful. And I just really liked this collection of poetry quite a bit. It was a bit haunting at times because she just captured the feeling of those times really, really well. And I'm very glad that she took on such an ambitious project and now can share it with future generations. Next up, I read The Black God's Drums by P. Djeli Clark. This is a short novella. I believe it's classified as YA because the main character is a girl named Jacqueline who calls herself Creeper, and she is a teenager. I think she might only be like 13 or so, but she is a pickpocket. She's kind of a street urchin living in an alternate steampunk New Orleans during the Civil War era. There's airships, there's just so much cool imagery. Everything that I love about P. Djeli Clark writing was present in this book, and it was just in snack size form. Basically, Creeper is out doing her kind of rounds on the streets, and she overhears some Confederate soldiers talking about a new weapon called the Black God's drums that they are going to bring into New Orleans in exchange. And so she overhears this information and she decides to sell that information to the other side. And in the process of doing so, she ends up kind of wrapped up in a lot of the action, and it was just a really fun, really quick, really cool story. Like I said, all the magic that I know and love from P. Djeli Clark was there. I really liked Jacqueline/Creeper, and I hope that someday she gets her own full-length novel, because I will absolutely be reading it. Then I read The Deep by Rivers Solomon. This is a story about the Middle Passage when pregnant enslaved women were thrown overboard because they were not worth the hassle. It's a kind of imagined world in which the children of those pregnant women became basically mermaids and created their own society and culture under the sea and survived. So in this story, the main character is a woman who is called the historian for her people. Basically, that means that she has taken on all of the memory and all of the trauma for her entire people. So the rest of the mer people, I guess, the rest of her people do not remember really where they came from or what their history is. But once a year they have an event where she shares that memory with all of them again. It's obviously very horrible, but that's like the only time of the year that she doesn't have to live with this burden. The story really kicks off when she has just decided that it is too much. She can't do it anymore. It's just too hard to live with this horrible tragedy all the time and not be able to share it with anyone. And so once she has shared it with the community, she runs away so that she can live unburdened by it. This story is really kind of dreamlike in the way that it's told. It feels like mythology. It's beautifully written and told, and it's just a great examination of cultural identity, transgenerational trauma, and the duty that we have to ourselves and to our communities. It was really short, it was really good, and it was really, really powerful. My second to last read for Black History Month this month was The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. This was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize several years ago and the National Book Award. This is a story of the time of American slavery, but reimagined in a way that the Underground Railroad is an actual underground train that is run by abolitionists and freed slaves to help enslaved people escape to freedom. So I think by reading that synopsis and finding that out, I expected this to be a bit fantastical, and it is not. It is just historical fiction with a twist of a real train, but there isn't any fantastic elements to it, just kind of a reimagining of history. So it was a bit different than what I expected, but I think that was just my misinterpretation of the synopsis. This story follows a enslaved woman named Cora from her childhood and then up through her escape from her plantation and the very many trials that she goes through on her journey to freedom. She escapes first to, I believe, South Carolina, and then discovers a bunch of horrible things happening there and has to escape again. So really, like all of these different places that she gets to, just more and more terrible things happen that forces her to flee further and further north. In between the chapters or sections that are about Cora and her journey, we get points of views from other characters within the story. Sometimes that would be other enslaved people that are trying to escape. Sometimes it is a slave catcher / bounty hunter who is searching for Cora. Sometimes it's from the perspective of some of the abolitionists that are helping Cora to escape. And all of the narratives were very interesting. I will say this is a bit dry. I didn't really connect to the characters very well, but I did really enjoy the story. It was just really bleak. Even the way that the story ended, Cora's still a bit unsettled. She doesn't really have a place to call home after feeling like she found a home several different times. And I just wish that it would have ended differently. I wished better things for the characters, better outcomes, but of course, history was this bleak for most Black Americans at the time. And so, yeah, I wish history could have been a lot different too, but I found this to be really powerful. I think this is a really important book, and I'm very glad that I read it. And then my very last book by a Black author this month was The Lies of the Ajungo by Moses Oze Utomi. This is a really short novella as well, and this is about a desert community that is called the City of Lies. One of the quotes that is repeated over and over throughout the story is, "There is no water in the City of Lies." It is about this community that has struggled immensely when the water all dried up. There is another community of people called the Ajungo, and they have plentiful water. And when the people from the City of Lies asked if they could share their water, they said, "We'll give you water in exchange for your tongues." And so all of the people in the community who are over the age of 13 have their tongues cut out, and in exchange for that, they're given water. But they're still only given basically just a trickle of water, where they still have to suffer, but it is just enough for them to survive. And so a lot of children from this community, right before they turn 13 and will have their tongues cut out, they wander out into the desert to try and find water for the community. And the hope is that, someday someone will find water and they won't have to live this way anymore. So that's the story of the main character. He wanders off into the desert knowing he'll probably die, but his mother has basically collapsed already, and he knows she'll die without water. So it's just about his journey and what he discovers along the way. Part of what he discovers is that after the people's tongues were all cut out, it was really easy for other people to rewrite their history and to lie to them about even what their own heritage was, because they were no longer able to tell their own stories. And so he discovers kind of this vast conspiracy when he wanders the desert and really discovers the truth of his people and of the Ajungo. So I found this to be a really compelling read. Honestly, it felt a bit like a prequel, or it felt like mythology, but in the way that often when you read like a prologue to a book, it'll tell you in the olden days, the gods did this type of thing. That's what this whole novella felt like to me. It felt like the setup for a story hundreds of years in the future, potentially. So I found that really fascinating, and it was a bit fever dreamy as well. There was also some cool magic in this one and some interesting characters. So I would highly recommend this. It has a sequel coming out, I think, next month, or one of the months coming up really soon. So that's exciting. I will definitely be picking up the second one. And then, like I mentioned earlier, I also finished up the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. This series currently has 7 books and novellas in it, and I had already read the first 5, so I read number 6 and number 7 in the month of February. Number 6 is called Fugitive, Telemetry, and I didn't realize this going into it, but book number 6 is actually a prequel to book number 5, and I was pretty disappointed by that. If I had known that, I would have read them chronologically to begin with, because the way that book 5 ended was setting up a journey for Murderbot to go on, that then when I started book 6, it was not on that journey. It was back on Preservation Station, kind of its home place. And so I was just bummed out by that, because I thought that Murderbot was going to be with some other characters from the series, and was not. But really, once I got over that and got past about the 25% mark, I got pretty immersed in the story. And this one was a bit of a murder mystery on Preservation Station, which I thought was a fun way to kind of change up the sameness of a lot of the other Murderbot books so far. And I did have a really good time. And then book number 7 in the Murderbot series is System Collapse, and I believe this one just came out last year. In book number 7, in the beginning of the story, Murderbot is kind of experiencing some PTSD type symptoms because of what happened to them kind of at the end of the last book. And that, I think, is good and realistic and important to portray, but at the same time, I just wasn't engaged by it. I didn't like the way the narrative was going when Murderbot was feeling that way. And so this kind of started off as my least favorite Murderbot book so far, but then Murderbot kind of not necessarily snaps out of it, but heals from that a bit. And so really in the second half of the book, I really got into it again. So this one pretty much picks up right where book 5 left off. It's a kind of a continuation of the adventure they were on from book 5, where they're trying to save a bunch of colonists from corporate slave labor. And the way that they do that in this book, I thought was really, really clever and really kind of quintessential Murderbot, because Murderbot loves watching reality TV so much, and they found a way to kind of pull that in order to help save the colonists. And I just thought that was really fun and clever, and you know, was a good reminder of like why we love Murderbot and we love this series. So yeah, I did have a good time with System Collapse. And the final book that I read, like I mentioned, is Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, which is the book that I picked out in the previous video called Have I Read Popular Books from Every Year I've Been Alive? So this book was published in 1994, but this book had previously been recommended to me by my friend Curtis. And so I actually bought this maybe like 2 years ago or so when he recommended it to me, but I had never like really pushed it into my TBR until I did that video. So that was really fun. This is basically a book about writing. I am working on a novel right now. It's also a bit of a memoir for Anne Lamott, who was a person I had never really heard of before this book. Anne Lamott is a pantser/discovery writer, which is the same kind of style of writer that I am. And so I found a lot of her advice and just seeing her talk about her own method really helpful for me and encouraging in a lot of ways. So I would definitely recommend this to other writers. At the same time, Anne is a bit of an odd person, and I thought a lot of her anecdotes were really off the wall, and like a lot of writing books, I think a lot of her writing advice was a little too prescriptive and one size fits all, when I don't really think that there's only one way to write and be a good, effective writer. So, but again, I think if you are a discovery writer and you like reading writing advice type books, that this was a really good one. I had a good time. So that is it for my February wrap up. 12 things, had a great time with all of them, honestly, and thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me for a little bit today. In the month of March, I'm doing a 5-star predictions vlog, the first clip of which I'm about to film right here. So if you want to hear more about this cool location or any of the books that I am super stoked about, be sure to keep a lookout for that, which will be posted later this month. As always, please be kind, read books, and hit the subscribe button below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you soon.